post the WhatsApp. Everyone should save the date. Tonight.
With the help of Hashem, we are learning Rosh Hashana Daf Chav Ches. It's Mamish Daf Koyach. We're going to learn, amongst other things, 3 huge topics, Shas topics, all in Daf Chav Ches. We're going to first begin on Daf Chav Zayin, Amid Beis, all the way in bottom of the Amid. We're going to have, there's a machlokes whether the statements were made by Rabbah or whether they were made by Rava. But let's go with the way it's printed inside our Gemaras, that Rabbah will make 2 statements. They appear to be contradiction. They appear to contradict themselves. They are both touching upon what will be the halacha, which we spoke about yesterday, if someone heard only a partial shofar blast. Now, we're not going yet into the details of how long does the blast have to be, but there's a certain minimum size of the tkiyah. You heard that. The one who blew the tkiyah blew a much longer tkiyah. For some reason, you didn't hear part of it, or the part that was blown was not blown at a time that there's a mitzvah for the shofar. It was still at night. Is a partial shofar blast hearing okay or not okay? We're going to see, he made 2 statements. Again, they appear to contradict themselves. So we're going to resolve that contradiction. And then the first big topic will be, the example will be, can a person hear the shofar from a horn that comes from an animal that belongs to Hegdish? And that's going to revolve around the question, as it's called, mitzvahs, lav le'hanais nitnu. That Hashem did not give us the mitzvahs for us to derive hana'ah, benefit from. Of course, the most beautiful thing is when a Yid loves to do a mitzvah. Gesund to hate, but that's not the purpose of the mitzvah. Mitzvah is not about my benefit. The mitzvah is about God's benefit. And we're going to see how this concept of mitzvahs, lav lehemis nitnu, will mamish affect certain halachas regarding the case that we mentioned and other cases. The second big topic that we will learn about today is the sugya of mitzvahs, whether mitzvahs tzrichos kavana or ein tzrichos kavana. Do you have to have intent while you are performing a mitzvah to perform the mitzvah? Now, there's another word which is the opposite of kavana, and that's called misasek. Misasek, let's translate the word misasek, is that you are preoccupied with something else. You're not even mindful that you did what you did. Now, as we will see, that there are many stages. Even when we subscribe, as we do, that mitzvahs don't need intent for you to fulfill the obligation, but you may not be preoccupied with something else. So misasek, if I did something in a preoccupied state, as will very clearly, God willing, explain, that won't be counted as a mitzvah. But it's possible that a person can do a mindful act, but they still don't have kavanah to do it for a mitzvah. Just give one example. I can eat. I can be mindful that I'm eating. Not that I'm thinking about something else and I'm just nibbling. But I'm not intending to do this for the mitzvah. If mitzvahs need kavanah, then it also would not count for the mitzvah. We paskin that mitzvahs don't need kavanah, as we will see, and therefore such an act will be counted as a mitzvah. And the third big topic will be the violation of Baal Tosef. We are not allowed to add to mitzvahs. Now, this third topic of Baal Tosef is going to be linked to the sugya of kavanah, because what happens if a person added a mitzvah, as we'll give examples, without kavanah? If mitzvahs need kavanah, then you can argue then to violate Baal Tosef, you needed to do something for the intent of adding to the mitzvah. If you had no such intent, then you won't be in violation. If mitzvahs don't need kavanah, then you can argue, well, neither will the violation of Baal Tosef demand kavanah, and a person will, so to say, violate Baal Tosef without that much effort. And the ultimate conclusion, I'm just reading the end of God, we have to get there today, is Lot says, loy boya kavanah. Mitzvahs don't need kavanah. To violate Baal Tosef, it will depend. If you are doing an act during the time of the mitzvah obligation, bismanoi, then you also don't need kavanah, even though you did something without kavanah. You're going to violate Baal Tosef. But if you did something, not even in the zman of the mitzvah, as we'll give examples, without kavana, then you won't violate Bal Tosef. And Chevra, without any further ado, again, let's start on Daf Chav Zayin, Amid Beis, Mamash at the end of the Amid, Amar Rava, as the Rosh's Goyres, we're going to read the Gemara inside Amar Rava. Daf Chav Ches. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shar kol midbar. Shaman mixas tkiya b'boy. Havamina is, like Rashi says, is that we are speaking about someone that is by the edge of the pit. Someone is by the edge of the pit. And the person who's blowing the shofar began blowing the shofar inside the pit, and then the blower walked out. So whoever's at the edge heard some of it while they were outside, but they were hearing the sound that was made inside, and then they heard it direct. Shama mixas tkiba boy. The blower began blowing it in the pit while they were outside. This is all the Havamina. And then mixas tkiya al sfasaboy, and the other part of the tkiya, same blast, they heard as the blower emerged and walked out of the pit. So there was no echo at all. Now I know that we learned yesterday, and we will come back to it soon, that when something is chaviv for you, you can make the effort, and even when you hear two sounds together, in our case, the shofar itself and the echo with a kavana, you can pick up only the sound of the shofar. We're going to leave that for later. Right now, we are going with that trei kol mashtama, which when you're hearing the echo, not good, but part of it was without an echo. So says Rabbi Yotza. Now, what does that imply? Again, based on, we made two premises. Number one, trei kol mashtama. We're going to leave that. You can't hear two voices at the same time. So when you hear the sounding of a shofar with an echo, it's not good. You heard some of it with an echo, but the end of the same blast, the blower walked out of the pit. So the end of the blast was good. Rabba says, yatsa, which would mean that only hearing part of a blast is good. Statement number two, mixas tkiya koydem sheyala moda shachar, clear from our Gemara, that the cutoff time for prior to which no mitzvah, post yes mitzvah is the crack of dawn. So if you began to hear the sound before Amud HaShachar, which is when there's no mitzvah at all, but the blast took, 10 seconds. The first 5 seconds was before the Amud. Umixas tkiya was la'achar she'al Amud HaShachar. Says Rabbah, lo yotza. Implying, since the whole blast was not heard when there is an obligation in a kosher way, partial blast is not good. So that's Abaya's question. So Amalei Abaya, whether it was to his teacher, whether it was to his colleague, Hassan, why is it that by this second case, you're telling me the be'ino kula tkiya b'chiyuva, right? Which is taka why, since part of it was before the Alois HaShachar, Vileke, you don't have it, so you're not yoitze. So how do you explain the first case? Hachinami, in the first case, how can you say yatsa? Why don't we say same thing? Be consistent. Be'ino kula tkiya b'chiyuva v'leka. Again, based on the premise that you heard the first half with an echo, and therefore it should not be good. So Gemara counters hachiyashtem. Even leaving the understanding of the first case as we have it, we're speaking about someone that's standing outside the pit. The blower began in the pit. The blower, during the blowing, walked out of the pit. The question is regarding the listener. Was he yoitze or not? Leaving it that way, still, we can explain the following. Hassan, in the second case of Rabbah, since you began to blow it at night, and laila lavs man chiyuvahu klal, in other words, so since there is no obligation at all, so therefore the sound that came during that time is garnished. That's why it's not okay. But over here, since people who are in the pit, as we learned yesterday, they will hear the sound of the shofar. By the way, that's the meaning of a pit. Again, let's just go that we're speaking about such a small pit that in there is no echo. So you hear the sound of the shofar. So in other words, if the sound is inherently valid, be'etzem it's valid, The only chisaron is that the listener, because there was an echo, muffling, mingling with the sound, then it's okay. But if the sound is inherently not okay, you blew it at night, then it's not okay. Says the Gemara. Now, by the way, this back and forth we're going to have in the next few lines. It's a chazara from yesterday. Notice we are leaving the premise that as long as the sound is inherently okay, the listener doesn't have to hear the whole sound. Which umemela, and this memela will stand. Doesn't have to be only the end. It can be any part of. It can be also only the beginning. If you only heard the beginning and not the end, as long as the sounding was inherently okay, yatsa. I have a problem with that. Toshima. Problem is Mishnah number 1. Now we already learned, right? We're going to have the taka b'reshoina umashach b'shniya kishtayim. Leaving the blowings of the shofar the way it used to be, simple. Tarat, tarat, tarat. Before the details. Tkiya, trua, tkiya, tkiya, trua, tkiya, tkiya, trua, tkiya. So the first tkiya is a standalone tkiya. First stanza, the first clause, first blowing. Trua, tkiya. The final tkiya of that group is juxtaposed to another tkiya which begins the second tarat. So there are 2 tkiyas together. So someone decided that the length, whatever your length is, let's say every tkiya by you is 5 seconds. So 5 seconds, trua, then you blew a 10-second tkiya. Your kavanah was half for the end of the first, and that other half should be for the first of the second clause. Says the Mishnah, Ein biyadei ela achas. Again, there's a machlokes. Almost all the Rishonim learn that at least it's valid like the end of the first. You have one. The Maratz Geyes, that's a very important tradition, says, you know what achas means? It's worth nothing. Achas means that only the first tkiya is good. The tkiya before the trua, since you had in mind for this to count for 2, and it doesn't count for anything. Be that as it may, here's the kasha. If mixas tkiya is enough, amai, why don't we say tisalekli betarte, let it be reckoned as 2 sounds? So again, the Gemara answers, no, zoisloi. That pasuke tikiyasa mahadadi like paskina. In other words, we cannot split the sound. You can't split a sound. You can say that even though you didn't hear all of the sound, you were yoitza. But splitting a sound we can't do, and therefore, ein biyadei ela achas. Another attempted kasha on the premise of the understanding of Rabbah that you only have to hear part of the tkiya, soif tkiya, as long as the tkiya was inherently okay. Toshima, it says in the Mishnah, if someone blew in a pit, our Mishnah, or inside a cistern, hapitas, or inside of a large barrel, says the Mishnah, if you heard the sound of the shofar, you're yotz. The im koil havara shama. Now again, I'm going to come back to what we learned yesterday about chaviva. Let's go right now that you cannot hear 2 sounds together. So im koil havara shama means if you also heard the sound of the echo, then you're not yoitza, because you didn't hear only the sound of the shofar. Problem is, here's a problem. The echo begins a bit later. So the amai, why don't we say leipoik betchias tkiya? Let the person who's blowing be yoitza by the fact that he heard the beginning of the sound of the shofar before before the echo combined with it. And if shama soif tkiya yotza mixas, so shama tchila should also be okay. And because of this kasha, we are now reversing our understanding of Rabbah. And what's the reversal of our understanding of Rabbah? That Rabbah does not hold that if you hear part of a sound, you're yoitza. A part of a sound is not good. Even if it's inherently good, you have to hear to the whole sound. Now, if someone blew a tkiya of 5 seconds, then 5 seconds is enough. If someone chose to blow a tkiya of 10 seconds, if that was his tkiya blessed, then you have to hear the ganze tkiya blessed. So now we have to simply relearn the first statement on top of the Amid. Before we go there, what the Achronim speak out is the following. I just want to go back to this to close this issue of, can you hear 2 sounds? Can you not hear 2 sounds? If I am the listener, I'm the shoymeya, and there are two people, like we learned, reading Hallel, or two people reading the Megillah, which is a lot more rare and therefore more chaviv, more than the Monday and Thursday and Shabbos afternoon Torah reading, then if I'll make an effort, I can discern one from the other. But if I am blowing the shofar, I'm already occupied with the blowing of the shofar. And as we'll actually see, we'll have the sugya later, the ultimate mitzvah is not to blow, it's to listen, the shmoya. If I'm blowing the shofar, and from my blowing there is the shofar and the echo, then I don't have enough brain power to blow and to hear only the shofar over the echo. No, it's chaviv. If something mishum the chaviv, what's the exact lashon? That if it's chaviv, you can hear chaviv yohav date. Chaviv yohav date means if I am not blowing at all, if I'm not speaking at all, if I'm only listening to someone else, and it has to be from two people. When Hashem said zachar v'shamar, even though it was chaviv and there was a yohav date, but without a nes, we would not be able to hear it because it came from one source. When it comes from two sources, chaviv yohav date. But if I'm the one blowing, even chaviv, even yohav date won't work. Okay, but coming back over here, the Gemara reinterprets that ki amar Rabba. You know what Rabba was speaking about? He wasn't speaking about a listener standing outside the pit. Rabba was speaking about the blower. What happens if when I blow the shofar, I'm in the pit, and during the blowing, I walked out of the pit? Now, when a pit is not large, there won't be a sound of the echo in the pit. The echo will only begin outside the pit. So Rabba is saying that if I'm blowing the shofar in the pit, and during my tkiya blast, I walk out of the pit, I was yoitza. Why was I yoitza? Because I heard the entire sound. Why? Because when I was in the pit, for me, there's no echo. The moment I walked out of the pit, Shleima, once I'm out of the pit, there's weiter no echo. There was never a time that for me there was an echo. Now, when I was blowing in the pit, during that moment, someone outside the pit would hear it with an echo. If there would be yoav date, he would be yoitza. If there wouldn't be yoav date, then it would be a mingling of sounds. He would not be yoitza. Only problem is pshita. Of course, if it's only about me, of course, there's no echo. That the blower is yoitza. Gemara clarifies. I'll tell you the chiddush. The tema you might argue that there is a small possibility that while the person is walking out of the pit, there might be a moment in where his ear, which is where he's listening, is already outside the pit. The shofar that's continuously making a sound is still in the pit, and for one instant, there is me hearing the sound with an echo, which I cannot hear just the sound of the shofar. So that broke up the tkiya, and I have to hear the whole sound from the beginning until the end. And therefore, komash malan, that this is something so unlikely that halacha doesn't have to take that into account. It's possible, depends on the position of the shofar and the position of my head and the way I kricht out of the board. Okay, get it. Now again, the first topic now will be this whole sugya of mitzvahs lav lahenes nitnu. And I know this is a topic that's discussed many times, and it's good to remember that the Torah, Hashidim, and Aniyim don't think that we got the whole sugya over here, and we're learning it very quick, but this is a big topic. And the example, the opener for this topic is the following. Amar Rav Yehuda, b'shoifer sher oyla lo yiska. Now let me just clarify the case. When you have a horn, you have a person who designated a carbon oyla, and that animal has a horn. Now, I just want to tell you like this. If the animal was slaughtered and the blood was sprinkled, from that time on, the hide, which will include the horn, belongs to the Kaihanim. That's not the case of Rav Yehuda. We're speaking about a case where the horn was detached of the animal prior to Shechita, or even after Shechita before Zrikas Adam. At that moment, the horn is an oila. It's part of a carbon oila. What's a carbon oila? Kache. Belongs to God.
It's not a moon.
So he's asking, if you cut off the horn, does that render it blemished? First, I think not. And that's irrelevant because it's still an oila. Okay, now, so first of all, don't blow from it. That's a given because it belongs to Hegdish. But here's the point, a big chiddush. But if you ve'im taka, upa, you're yotza. Now we'll have to explain why. Now look, in contrast, we're going to speak now of an animal that has a lesser amount of kedusha, kachekalim, for example, a shlamim. Same thing. The horn was detached of the animal before zrikas adam. No, it's b'shayfer shel shlamim. I mean, it's shlamim lo yiska. But you know what? If you blew, even bidi eved lo yatsa. How do you explain that? Normally, shlamim has a lower amount of kedusha, so the law should be more lenient. And now we explains Rav Yehuda. My tama, because oila, that's the irony. We don't have that much time to go into all of the details, but there is something belonging to Hegdish, and then there is a higher level that belongs to Hegdish to the point that if you misappropriate that which belongs to Hegdish, then you're chayev me'ilah, which means you have to return the value, you have to add a chaimish, you have to bring a carbon, but we're not going to focus on that. We're going to focus on one detail, that if a person, God forbid, violated this prohibition of me'ilah, after they violated, something ironic happens. That item becomes chulin. So oila, now here's the thing, kachim, the animal is in the category of me'ilah from when you designated the animal, mamish, until the end, because it all belongs to God. By kachim kalim, if I designated an animal for kachim kalim, since some of it is eaten by the kahanim, some of it is eaten by the owners, it's not b'chlal included in me'ilah. Now, by kachim kalim, after the zrikas adam, now the parts that are supposed to go on the altar, which is the chelev, that is bas me'ilah. Only those parts. So there's ironically, so oila bas me'ilah, and because of this general rule, keep the malba once. You were moil. How were you moil? Because you used it. No, it's after you blew it. Nafkal ala chulin. So it's like a catch-22. So now that it went out to chulin, you can't say you were not yoitza. You can't say you were not yoitza. Now I want to ask a question. Still, okay. Shlamim the lavene meilaninu isuruhu derachiv. Even the items that belong to Hegdish, that if someone uses them, they won't be chayiv me'ilah, it doesn't mean you can use it. It belongs to God. So that prohibition doesn't change. The status doesn't change because it's not bas me'ilah. Since therefore what? Therefore, you did not fulfill your obligation. So maskiv l'rava doesn't make sense. If it's about the fact that when someone violates me'ilah, they change the status, that it goes out to chulin. You know when that happens? After you used it. After you used it in our context would mean after you heard all of the mitzvah, whatever the mitzvah is. Tarat, tarat, tarat. Before you fulfill the mitzvah, you didn't use it fully yet. Amalei Rava. Ema small, only lebasar the taka. Well, that's only after you made all the soundings. But ki taka, while you are sounding it, still be isura taka. It should be just like the shlamim. So therefore, elo amarava echad zeh ve'echad zeh taka lo yotzam. That was step number one. And then he went ahead and he said, Hadar Amar. Now I want to explain something just about the me'ilah. Like, so people don't want to be moil. People don't want to be moil. You know what happens, Shlomo, when the Torah says, I was not yoitza, that I was not oiver me'ilah. You have what's going on over here. Because I only am moil if I derived benefit. Now we're paskening that you're not the mila of saying lo yatsa. By the way, that's also by the shlamim, both by the oila and by the shlamim. Why lo yatsa? I'll tell you why lo yatsa. Not because it went out to chulin. Because if we're going to say lo yatsa, it means that I didn't have benefit. So this person doesn't want to be yoitza. Being yoitza makes the violation. So lo yatsa. But then came along Rav and he said, no. If the only reason why we're going to say lo yatsa is because you don't want to be in violation, what is the violation? The fact that you had benefit. Yeah, there was no benefit from mitzvahs. Echad zeh ve'echad zeh yatsa farvas, because mitzvah is lav lehenois nitnu. Now I want to make something clear. If mitzvah is lav lehenois nitnu, what happens if a person eats psar kachim? Of course, the chayiv me'ilah. When I do something that begashmi is, I get hana from my body derived benefit. That's called hana. Mitzvahs lav lehenois nitnu will never be applied. That if I'm going to eat for Su'udah Shabbos, God forbid, psar kachim, covered Shabbos kodesh, I didn't have hana. We don't say that. If my body has gashmi is dika hana, that's called me'ilah. Here we're speaking about koil. In other words, koil, like reyach, is not something physical that is integrated in your body. So what's the hana? The hana here is there's a mitzvah, taka. But the fact that the purpose of mitzvahs is not for us to derive benefit, with one exception. I just want to throw it out there, and that's the mitzvah of learning Torah. That's why we say, and that's the Sachat Shavit that says in Afikei Tal and the Hagdama that we say in Birchas Torah B'Hadav No, that part of the mitzvah is that we should feel the sweetness in the learning. It was given for Hana, Oichet. And that's called Torah Lishma, according to many. But coming back over here, mitzvahs lav lahenes nitnu. It's Gavaldik Kevortis. So Koydem Kol, the first premise was, you know why you're not Yoitze? Because if you would be Yoitze, that will be the violation. Side by the oila, side by the shlamim. Then says the Rabbi, no, since mitzvahs were not given for your hana'ah, therefore you can be Yoitze the mitzvah, and you still didn't violate. Now, l'chatchila, you shouldn't listen to it. That's what he said. Not by the oila, not by the shlamim. But b'di'evid, you're not going to change anything. It won't cause a me'ilah. It won't cause anything that you took from the Beis HaMikdash, so b'di'evid you're Yoitze. And therefore applying the same rule of mitzvahs lav lahenes nitnu to other cases. Amar Rav Yehuda.
What about the noise that you don't need to hear it again?
So Shlomo is asking, how is it no hana? You don't have to hear it again. So all of that is not called hana. Okay, I can even argue that we should want to keep the mitzvah so much that now that I don't have to hear it again, that's a downer. Oh my God, that's it. Shine agat on the mitzvah. Okay. Amar Rav Yehuda, mamash min hakotza lakotza. We went from the holy to zelu umazeh, not to chulin, to avodah zarah. The shoifer shall avodah zarah. Now, either that means that someone worshipped the horn, or it means that the horn was used in service of an idol. You can't have hana from that. It's asr b'hana. But now that we established that mitzvahs, since they were not given for our hana'ah, they were not given for our pleasure, they were not given for our benefit. And again, we're not speaking about gashmi yazdika, tangible benefit we get, if God forbid. But here we're speaking about a sound. So let's go to sound. That if you blew, same concept. Why yotza? Avodah zarah, because mitzvahs lav lahenes nitnu. If I would have hana'ah by being yoitze, this is the key. Therefore, Chazal say, I would not want to be yoitze. Because if my fulfillment will bring me hana'ah, and the prohibition is I may not have hana'ah, I would rather not have hana'ah than to keep the mitzvah. But since mitzvahs lav lahanes nitnu, I can get the mitzvah, and I still didn't have halachic benefit. Another case. So that's a unique case that if the majority of the peoples of a town, they were missionized, they were convinced by locals, not only for them to want to serve an idol, but God forbid they were oved avodah zarah. So in certain circumstances, if the city is not a city on the border, there's many rules, then all of the belongings of the city must be burnt. Now we have a new layer. The moment something must be burnt, not only can you not have hana, to which we counter mitzvahs lav lahanis nitnu, but here you can't fulfill the mitzvah. Lo yiska. Here, if there's a horn that belongs to the Iran Nidachas, don't use it. The imtaka lo yotza. Why? Not because of hana'ah. My tama, since something that's about to be burnt, something that halachically must be burnt. Iran Nidachas, we say katuse mikata shiur. Its measurements are considered already pulverized. But mele, you're missing the measurement. We learned yesterday or 2 days ago that the shiur of a shofar is a tefach, which is a little bit bigger, longer than your fist. So it should stick out from both ends. So it's a lack in shiur. Let's go weiter. Amar Rava, again, all based on mitzvahs lav lahanis nitnu, hamoider or hamudar hana mechaveiroi. if I made a neder, I prohibit your things to give me pleasure. I may not have pleasure from you. I made such a neder. Now, if I made a neder that I cannot have pleasure from you, hana, pleasure, benefit, can you blow the shofar for me? Based on what we are learning, yes, you could. My fellow could blow shofar for me. More than that, not only if I made a neder, which is a generic neder, but I didn't specify. What happens in hamudar hanami shofar? If I specify this shofar is asur upon me for hana, this shofar, muter litkoya boy tkiya shel mitzvah. That shofar may be used for me, all because of mitzvahs lav lehonois nitnu. My vow was not to have hana. Hana means pleasure / benefit. Mitzvahs are not here to give me pleasure / benefit. They are here to bring the Shekhinah down into the world, which is what God wants. It's to give nachas to the Oibishter. It's not for my benefit. No problem. However, there's a nuance. But before we get into the nuance, just to reiterate that mitzvahs lav lechon leisnitnu was only said if my body is not getting any pleasure from the physical of what I am engaging in. So here we're speaking about a sound. The same thing will be with a reyach. These are non-tangibles. When it comes to a physical bodily pleasure, even if it's connected to a mitzvah, so there's the benefit of the mitzvah that halachically is not called benefit, but if it's also with a bodily pleasure, that will be problematic. And here we're going to give examples. Says the Ba'amarava, and if I make a vow not to have benefit from you, and now I became tamei, and we have in our region the mechatos, and someone is needed to sprinkle the mechatos on me, and I'm not ingesting it. But you know what? If it's summer, hot, and the waters are cool, even though the amounts are very little, epis, physical, I know I get. So says Rabbah, Maza all of mechatas b'moisak shamim. During the wintry season when it's cold, when there is no benefit of also getting sprinkled with water, the only benefit is the mitzvah that I'm becoming purified. Again, since mitzvahs lav l'hanis nitnu, you can throw it on me. I made a vow not to have hana. It's a mitzvah. And similarly, if I make a vow specifying this spring of water is asur upon me. So if it's winter, and therefore going into cold water in winter doesn't give me any physical hana, at least for most people, the only hana is I'm becoming purified. Since mitzvah is lav lohanis nitnu toivel by Tefilla shel mitzvah be meisak shamim avoloi be meisak chamon. And again, Tosfos in the bottom explains why all these cases are needed, but the kids said we got to the point. Okay, and now we're going to the big topic number 2 of today. And that is whether mitzvahs need halachic intent. We'll define that. Mitzvahs tzrichos kavana. Without the kavana, you didn't do the mitzvah, or mitzvahs don't need kavana. It's better to have kavana. It doesn't need kavana. We, Baruch Hashem, are zecher to learn Chassidus, to make one thing very clear, that when Chassidus speaks about kavana, it b'chlal means something other, something different. In Tanya, kavana means doing a mitzvah with enthusiasm. Doing a mitzvah with ava and yira. That's the kavanah and chassidus. We're not focusing on doing it with love of God and fear of God. We're speaking about mindfulness, and again, important, just to repeat, there's something called misasek. Misasek means that I was preoccupied with something else. My body did something. My mind was not even aware that I was doing what I was doing. Misasek is zikr, not good. We'll give examples in a moment. Kavanah means, I'll go into an example of eating matzah. A person can eat without knowing that they're eating. You could be so into your learning, and there was a plate of Danishes next to you, that all of a sudden the plate is empty. You don't even know who ate it. That's halachically not called that you ate. Then there is, I'm eating a matzah, but I'm not eating it to fulfill the mitzvah of matzah. I'm eating it to eat. I know that I'm eating, but I don't have in mind the mitzvah. That's the question. So says the Gemara, they sent a halach to the father of Shmuel that if there was a scenario where kefa'oi v'achal matzah, someone compelled the other to eat matzah. Now the key, Rashi, most Rishonim It's not about me being compelled. It means, why was I compelled to eat matzah? Not me, someone else. Because that someone else didn't want to do the mitzvah. Someone forced him to do the mitzvah. So when he ate it, you can only force a person to do the act. That's the biggest koyach. You can't force the person to have in mind l'shem mitzvah matzah. He doesn't want to eat matzah. So that's the example. Someone ate, but they did not eat l'shem mitzvah matzah. So they told him, yatsa. He was yatsa. Same with tefillin. Now, hold on. Kafoiman, who forced the person? Because there is an internal forcing, and ilema kafoi shay, that a demon forced him. Demons, mental illness are synonymous. In other words, maybe it means that this is a person that goes in and out of stages of sane to insane. While in a state of insanity, then he ate the matzah. If that would have been the meaning that he was internally forced, he wasn't of his well mind, then you know what? He won't be yotzeh. Because while a person is in a phase of insanity, they are exempt from all the mitzvahs. And if they do the mitzvah in that stage, then they go back into being sane, then they have to do the mitzvah again. If you have a person that's item cholim, sometimes the person is considered halachically sane. Item shoita, sometimes the person is considered deranged. Right? They have these two personalities. So then the din is, kishu cholim, when the person is saying, he's considered a bona fide bar chiyuv, a bar das, and he's obligated to keep the mitzvahs. And the mitzvahs that he keeps in that stage, in that frame of mind, is counted as a mitzvah. But kishu shoita, while he's in that moment of temporary insanity, and therefore, while a person has the status of a shoita is exempt from the mitzvahs, and therefore, if a person keeps a mitzvah in a state of exemptfulness, the mitzvah will not be valid. So why would they tell the father of Shmuel Yatza? So it's not speaking about a person who was internally forced because he was mentally not well, or he was forced by a demon. Amar Ravashi, no, Shekafu Parsiim, the Persians forced him. In other words, he doesn't want to do the mitzvah. How Mashiach will bring around a change in the world. That the Persians, they love forcing, but they'll use their forcing for a mitzvah. Go do a mitzvah. So since a person didn't want to do it and he was forced by some external force to do the act, we say the act he did, he knew he's doing the act, but he didn't. You can't force for me to want. You can't touch that of mine. That's me. And that's the chiddush that mitzvahs don't need kabbalah. Amar Rava.
What does it mean that Persians forced them? What does that? I mean, forgetting the Persian part. What does that mean?
The way some explain Kevan is that if a Jew would have forced me, then maybe I did it for a mitzvah, because the Jew who's doing the forcing is mentioning mitzvah, right? It's like a father telling us, "You gotta eat the matzah." So even though the kid didn't want to do it, but the one who's doing the forcing is speaking about God and speaking about mitzvahs, so maybe you did it for the mitzvah. The Persians, the reason why we gave an example of the Persians is because they don't want me to keep the mitzvahs. They wanted me to eat for whatever reason. We're just trying to paint the case, Kevan.
Persian non-Jew.
Persian non-Jew. Oh, of course. I'm sorry, Kevan. A Persian non-Jew.
No, I knew that. I understand that.
In other words, the point is that no mitzvah was mentioned. We're trying to find a scenario where someone was mindful to do what they did physically, but their intent, l'shem mitzvah, was not there.
Got it.
Okay. And therefore, Amar Rava, here again, Amar Rava, reversed of what we began to share with. It's very important also, but let's just go what it says inside that. Rava says, zoy meres, that hatoikei al-shir yatsa. Someone blew a shofar. The intent was to make a melody. He wanted to make the sounds of tarat or tashrat or tashat, but it wasn't l'shem mitzvah yatsa. That's the point. The point is, as long as you were mindful that you're doing something, even though you didn't do it l'shem mitzvah, you're good. I pshita. I needed Rava mamish hainu hach. No, not pshita. And now we'll see the hemshech hadvarim from mitzvahs lav lahenus nitnu to this sugya of mitzvahs slichos or ein slichos kavanah. Mao the tema. Over here, Echoil matzah omar Rachmana. What is the mitzvah? The mitzvah is for you to eat matzah. And this person didn't want, but was forced, and he ate. And let's add the words of Rashi, and v'nehene ma'achi lasoi. You had hana'ah. Coming back to the hana'ah now. So maybe, even though you didn't have in mind the shame, mitzvahs, matzah, but you had hana'ah from the eating. Maybe that's why it's good enough. But over here, when the Torah is not speaking about a mitzvah that's connected to a physical act, but it's about listening. Listening is something more ruchniistic. It's mamish connected. And just like we said, mitzvahs lav lohanis nitnu, one could have argued, and look at the words of the Gemara. But over here, zichroin teruaksiv, a remembrance of the blessed. If you're not doing it l'shem mitzvah, what remembrance do you have? Let's consider him preoccupied. In other words, if you don't have in mind l'shem mitzvah, think about it. We're not speaking about it's not about the blower. The mitzvah is not the blower. The mitzvah is to listen. If you're not listening l'shem mitzvah, we can argue since your body has no hana'ah, it's just as bad as being completely misasik. Because remember, even when we say that mitzvah is ein, tzricha is kavana, misasik is not good. So where do we draw the line? So when it comes to a physical action, we can say very clear, right? If you have hana'ah, even though you didn't do it l'shem mitzvah, that's okay. But if you're doing something that's not gashmiistic, you don't have hana'ah. So maybe the meaning of the mitzvah is to listen, to remember. We have to remember Aketas Yitzchak, whatever it is, we have to remember Hashem. If there's no memory because there's no mitzvah involved, maybe it's garnished. If it's nothing, it's like misasek. Kumash Malon. No, we don't say that. No, there is, as we'll see in a moment, I wasn't even paying attention. That's b'chlal not good. The moment I'm listening to the sound, even though I didn't listen to the sound, the shame mitzvahs, shofar, yes, because of this psak, that mitzvah is ein tzricha is kavana, you'll be yotzeh. Alma, we see kasava rava, that mitzvah is ein tzricha is kavana. And now we're going to challenge Rava and listen to our bomb questions, one after the other. We learned in the Mishnah that if a person was reading in the Torah, and Vigiazmana Mikron, punct the time of the recitation of the Shema came about, you're reading from a Sefer Torah. You're reading from a Chumash. You're reading Parsha Shema. Now, punct, it's the time to read Shema. Says the Mishnah, Im kivan liboy, if you directed your mind, what does that mean? Let me get the mitzvah, then you're yotza. The imlav lo yotza. If you read it without kivan libo, you're not yotza. Why? A gavaldik, if mitzvah is ein tzriches kavana, as long as you read it, you should be yotza. My love, kivan libo lotzes. If there's a lack of directing your mind to fulfill the obligation, you will not fulfill the obligation. Answers the Gemara, loy. Likrois. Like we mentioned, even when we say mitzvahs, lav tzrichos kavana, but misasek is not good. You have to be mindful by the fact that you're reading. Pay attention to the words that you're reading. The Gemara said that doesn't fit in that Mishnah. Likroi sokokari. We're speaking in the Mishnah, speaking about a person hoyu koya batoira. So on top of the koida, you need kavana. How can you have koida without kavana if the kavana is to read? You're reading. The Gemara says no, it could be. That it could be b'koida lahagia. It's giving you an example. You have a Sefer Torah. You want to make sure the Sefer Torah is not possible. So what you do is today you open it up. Many people just look. Many people read, but they're mumbling the words. They don't care to clearly articulate the words because the whole purpose is just to make sure there's no mistakes in the Sefer Torah. So the Mishnah says, you want to be yotzeh? Make sure you read the words clearly. But you don't need to read the words clearly. L'shem mitzvahs kriyas shema. That you don't have to do because mitzvahs lav tzrichas kavana. Another kash. Toshema. Now our Mishnah. You were walking behind the shul, or and the shamakol shofar, and you ended up hearing the soundings, the blast of the shofar. Oy kol megillah zakt our Mishnah dafago im kivan liba yotza vim lav lo yotza. Here again, what do you mean kivan liba? You heard. If you don't need kavanah, you heard. My love, im kivan liboy lotza is kavanah. You have to have in mind right? You have to have in mind that I'm doing the mitzvah. No, you have to have in mind to listen. You must have intent to hear. Again, the same kasha. The Mishnah says you walked by the shul and you heard. You heard. No, the Gemara says, you know what nesasik would mean? That if you did not pay attention to hear the soundings of a shofar, not for the mitzvah, just the soundings of a shofar, sabur chamoir ba'almuhu. If you are completely in a misasik mindset, if you're not focused on listening to sounds, you're focused on your learning, and a sound is made, your mind doesn't even register it as a shofar. The mind says, I'm hearing a noise. Could be it's a chamoir, what's called braying. Could be it's another noise. So that's the meaning of the Mishnah. As long as you focused your mind enough to know that you're listening to a shofar, not the mitzvah shofar, but you have to know that you're hearing a shofar. If you don't even have that intent, then in your brain, there wasn't even a registry that you're listening to a sound of a shofar. You're listening just to a sound. Another kasha. Esvei, now come from a braisa. Neschaven shemevel and neschaven mashmiya, and this is already more problematic. Right? So you have the one who's listening, and you have the one we call the blower, the one who's making the sound heard. And both of them have to have kavanah. So the braisa says, if only the listener had kavanah, the mashmiya, the one making the sound heard, we call that the blower. But we're not focusing on that. We're focusing on the mashmiya because the mitzvah is lishmoya, not litkoya. Or reverse. If the kavanah was only by the mashmiya, the loin is chaven shemeya, if then lo yotza. Actually is chaven shemeya or mashmiya. Now you have a problem. Because bish loim is chaven mashmiya, but is chaven shemeya. Now the blower is blowing. He has in mind to blow. If kavanah doesn't mean l'shem mitzvah, it only means to blow. The mashmiya by default has kavanah. That works. And the mashmiya and the shemeya maybe was hearing a chamoid. He has to have in mind that he's hearing a shofar. That stanza works. Without that minimum kavanah, his brain might say, "Oh, I'm hearing up the sound of an animal." If kavanah doesn't mean l'shem mitzvahs shofar, it doesn't mean that. It just means to make the sound. The mashmiya for avada has kavanah by default. Lav that he, what does it mean no kavanah? That he's tekei al shir. He doesn't have, not kavanah can only fit. He has a mind to blow, but he doesn't have a mind for the mitzvah. And you see, it's not good. You need to have kavanah le mitzvah. So the Gemara says, no, not a kasha. Because you know what? The mashmiya blowing without kavanah, you know what that can mean? Forget about the mitzvah of shofar. He wanted to make sounds, stam sounds. Punkt, it happened that the sounds that he made were the tkiya through a tkiya. He didn't even have in mind that. That's when it's not good. Dilma the kamenabach nabuche. Namach means he's barking. That means he doesn't have in mind to make the particular sounds that are needed to be made for the mitzvah. So we are still standing our ground that it's shaykh by the shofar that there should be the level of mesasek, which is taka not good. What we call, you don't even have in mind to make the sounds of the shofar. You don't even have in mind to hear those sounds of a shofar. That's not good. The moment you have in mind to make the sounds of a shofar, to hear those sounds, even if you don't have in mind that you're listening to it, l'shem mitzvah shofar, you're good because mitzvahs aim srichos kavanah. Amar Abaye elamata. Now we're making a link, and this is the third big topic of today, and let's see how far we can get. Based on the premise that mitzvahs don't need kavanah, that is going to be easier for me to fulfill a mitzvah, even without l'shem mitzvah al biyotza. But that should also, in the instances where that act of a mitzvah is being done in a way that this is considered adding to the mitzvahs, and if a person adds to the mitzvahs, they violate Bal Toisef, then the violation of Bal Toisef should also happen even though the person who did that act did not do it l'shem mitzvah. It's a two double-sided coin. You can't get it both ways. If the mitzvahs don't need kavanah to fulfillment, so if I did that act, not l'shem mitzvah, but if I did it ba'oifen that this is Bal Toisef, I should violate Bal Toisef. So Amar Abaye elama'ato hayoshem bas shmini basukah. If a person sleeps in the sukkah the night going into the 8th, he's not doing it l'shem mitzvah sukkah, but he did the act of sleeping, so which is living in a sukkah. Then he should get malchus for Bal Toisef. Is that the case? Would you subscribe to that? So Amar Loi, Rava tells Abaye. Again, it might be Rabbah, but we're going to go with our Girsa. Sha'ani Oimer. Here's different. That mitzvah is Einoi Oiver Aleim. When do you violate Bal Toisef? Only bismanam. For example, it's a time I have to put on tefillin. If a person, God forbid, will not put 4 portions, but they're going to add a 5th portion, bisman keeping the mitzvah. That's called adding. Baal Tosef, don't add. But during the 7 days, there's no Baal Tosef because the mitzvah is to live in the sukkah 24/7. After sukkahs, it's not bismane. After bismane,
It's like sleeping a month later.
it's like it's not shaykh to the mitzvah. That's why you don't violate. Oh, Azoy. So Moshe, Rab Shemen bar Abba. Now there's a challenge from a Braisa, and then we're going to see soon a potential challenge from a Mishnah. Now, whenever you can bring a challenge from a Braisa or from a Mishnah, if you could, you bring it from a Mishnah, but he didn't, as we'll explain. It says in a Braisa, if you have a coin that already was Oila, he already today fulfilled his obligation of going up on the platform to give Birchas Kahana. He should not say that since I'm on the platform and God told me to bench, so we have in the Torah, we have the words of his bracha. Yo'er, right? So he's going to say to himself, there's three psukim. Let me add another bracha, for example, and beautiful words of the Torah. Hashem Elokei Avosechem Yosef Aleichem. Words that Moshe Rabbeinu told us. Says the Braisa, he may not do so. Talmud Leimer Lo Sifun Al Adav. Now, guys, halka. Once the kohen already gave the Birchas Kahanim, it's not zmanei. Oh. He already fulfilled his obligation. So money, and yet the Katani the Avar answers the Gemara. No, you didn't understand the Braisa. The Kohen is adding the bracha before he articulated the 3 blessings of the Torah. I don't know, he made the first Hashem Elokeichem Yosef Aleichem. That's where you're not allowed to do it. The Gemara says that's not true. Because it says in a Braisa that seeing or saying, and then he wants to add. No, it must mean sayim bracha achas. No, frek the Gemara v'atanya sayim kol berchosav. And even after he finished all the 3, if he adds Baal Tosef, is a raya that even shaloi bezmana you can be over on Baal Tosef. So the kasha comes back about will you violate Baal Tosef sleeping in the sukkah on the 8th day? Answers the Gemara, no, it's still you can't compare the 8th day. And where there is no biblical obligation while you are in Israel, chutz la'aretz, you have a suffix. We take eat in the sukkah without a bracha, but you can't compare that to birchas kohanim because shana hacha the ilu kiv and the ilu mesram leitzibur achrina. If there would be another tzibur that did not yet hear the birchas kohanim, hadin mevarech, he could bench them. So you can't say that since this kohen already gave the bracha, it's not zmanei. The whole day is zmanei. Kul layoim is zmanei. And I'll prove it to you. Uminat timra. That if a mitzvah could be performed again, even though you fulfilled your obligation, but since it could be performed again during the time of the potential performance, it's called the Zman. I'll prove it to you. The Tanan. And here, Chavre, B'kitzer, you have different karbanos, and Hashem tells us how to do the specific avodah of each carbon, and they differ. For example, how many applications of the blood of a sacrifice is applied on the altar varies from sacrifice to sacrifice. A bachar carbon, a meiser carbon only has 1 application, and the other carbonos have 4 blood applications. Really, it's not really 4, it's 2 that are 4, but they are called 4. Now, there's other details like, is the blood put under the chut hasikra, whether it's put over we're not getting into this right now. The topic of the Mishnah here that we are quoting will be, if you have bloods of different sacrifices, that each one has a different set of blood applications, they got mixed one with the other. And what's the challenge, Shlomo? Very simple. If my bachar got mixed with your meiser, each one only has to be applied once. Put it once for both. If, let's say, my shlamim got mixed, not only with your shlamim, with your oila, as long as the dam is put under the chut hasikra, if they share the same blood applications, you got no problem. Who cares that they got commingled? But if a blood of a carbon that only has to be applied once gets mixed with blood from a carbon that has to be applied 4 times, appreciate the challenge. Whatever you do is a problem. If you will only apply it once, well, then the one that needed 4 applications, Baltigra, you did less than got told. If you're going to apply all of it 4 times, then the one that only need 1 blood application, Bal Toiset. So let's read inside now. Blood of a carbon that only needed to be applied in 1 application. My bechar and your bechar, my meiser and your meiser, my bechar with your meiser, then there's no problem. Yitnu matana achas. Similarly, matan dalid, b'matan dalid. I just don't mix a chattas and an oila or a chattas with the other karbanis, because the chattas dam has to be applied on the koronos, at least over the red line. That's not the case. It's two karbanos that are mamish the same. My oila, your oila. My asham and your oila. It's oila, it's shlamim, it's a toida. Almost all the karbanos, you put shtayim, shein arba in the bottom. So then no problem, just because they commingled, yinasnu b'matan daled. The problem will be matan daled b'matan achas. And here, whatever you do, you got a problem. Machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Eliezer says, yinasnu b'matan daled. Which he holds that when you put it 4 times, you're not intending to put the Bukhar 4 times. The Bukhar you put once, the Dalit is for the other. He doesn't see that. Now, as they both admit, it's not ideal, but the better solution is at least to put Dalit. Rabbi Yeshua says the better solution is only to put, by the way, that's the way we pass, which is the Rambam. Don't forget that any carbon, if you made only one blood application, b'di'evid, you got the kapara. The problem is that you're diminishing from what God said, but here there's a reason, because if you put more, then the one that only had achas will be put 4 times. And they went back and forth. So Amalei Rabbi Eliezer, what do you mean? You're only going to put once? He tells Rabbi Yeshua, Hadei oiver al baltigra. Amalei Rabbi Yeshua, what, you're going to put 4 times? You also have the dam of a bachar or of a meiser? Hadei oiver bal toisef. Amalei Rabbi Eliezer. Now, like we said, you know what Bal Toisef means? In other words, if you have a Bechar and you put the Bechar of 4 with Shtaim Shemaber, that's Bal Toisef. Here, you're not doing it because of the Bechar. So Rabbi Yeshua says the same logic by me. Here, you know why I'm only putting it 1? Because I have an ear Bechar. Okay, so first of all, and now Rabbi Yeshua added by saying that if there is a non-ideal scenario, which is what we have here, something not ideal has to happen, we try to do the lesser problem. Violating to a certain degree what Hashem said by a non-action relatively is better than violating what God says by doing something. So there is a certain connection to being oiven al baltigra, but at least it was not an active violation. But kishinasata, if you're going to put 4 blood applications, so it's connected to the problem of bal toisef, but it's through an action. That's why Rabbi Yeshua holds nothing be matan achas. The atkan the Mishnah. Now the Gemara says gavaldik. Over here, what's the problem, Shlomo? You put 1 matan damim of the Bechar. That's it. The mitzvah was done. Why is it Bechal Bal Toisef? It's not the Zman of the mitzvah. The Ache Kiv and the Yavalei Matana bin Bechar. So already this Bechar got the mitzvah. Avalei Zmane. And yet you see there's an issue of Bal Toisef. Why? It must be because if today another person would come with another Bechar to this coin, and it would tell him, bring the carbon, he would have to bring it. Same concept of a Birchas Kohanim is that since the person, if a new mitzvah, the same mitzvah would come his way, would have to do it today, it's not called Avar Zmani. Lav mishum domrinen kilu kiven the ilam Israel buchrachlino hadar mazimin hey. Therefore, kol yoymohu. That's a raya. Counters they go, no, that's not a raya mimai. Maybe Dimlok some Rabbi Yeshua, the whole thing. Maybe Rabbi Yeshua holds mitzvahs oiver alema filu shleivis mana. Why do you have to insist? So the Gemara says that can't be. If that would have been Shitas Rabbi Yeshua, then I would have a problem. Why did Rab Shemin Bar Abba challenge from the Braisa? He should have challenged from this Mishnah. Anan hachi kamrinen. Rab Shemin Bar Abba, my time of shopping must listen, which is always a better source to challenge, and he brought a Braisa. He should have begun his challenge from the Mishnah itself. In other words, when Rava answered, what was Rava's answer? He should have said it's not true. You see from Rabbi Yeshua that you're over even shalei b'zmanim. Masnis and my tamalei masav must be given the ilu misram lebucharchinim boy the mazaminei. He couldn't bring a raya from Rabbi Yeshua that you're over even shalei b'zmani because he knew that it's considered zmanei kuliyam zmanihu. So now we have a problem. So why did he even ask from the Braisa? He already knew that difference. So what was his kasha to begin with? So the Gemara explains, no, I'll explain to you what Rab Shemin had in mind, and he only asked from the Braisa, not from the Mishnah. But Rab Shemin bar Abba, Hassan, by a kohen, if I come to a kohen with my bechor, even though the kohen brought your bechor today, he cannot tell me no. He's obligated to bring it. That's why it's clear from the Mishnah that bechor is called zmanei. He didn't even ask from the Mishnah. But when it comes to a kohen, the reason why Rab Shemin challenged this concept from the Braisa of Birchas Kohanim, you know why, my friends? Because a kohen who already gave Birchas Kohanim is not obligated to give it again. He could. He's not obligated. Elomar, Rav was going to say that still, since he could make it, it's called zmanei. Now, Rava Omar, it fits more if everything that we said now was said by Rabbah, and that's why the beginning of the sugya, according to the Rosh, was Rabbah was the one that said Atakei l'shir yatsa. But we'll stop over here, and we're going to have what we already spoke out the intro, the last few lines, which is very important. Another nuanced difference between whether you're doing a mitzvah, beneged the sugya of boya kavana ein tzrichas kavana, versus violating Bal Toisav. They don't necessarily travel on the same track, and that will take away the whole issue of sleeping in the Shmini Atzeres. To be continued.
Thank you. Rabbi, there's no Bal Toisav in Sukkah? Like if you stay an extra day, like as a kid, I always remember, you're not allowed to stay an extra day in the Sukkah.
So Tzvika, when you make it clear that you're not here l'shem mitzvah Sukkah, then there's no problem. There's a Marasayan issue. It's not as bad as people say.
But it seems like it says that if you did sleep for the purpose of the mitzvah of Sukkah on the 8th day, that you would be that.
Danny, you're right. We didn't read the last few lines. In other words, the conclusion will be that by mitzvahs ain't tzrichas kavana. By Bal Toisav, if it's bismanei, even without kavana, you violate. Shaloi bismanei, which is the 8th day, you only violate if you have kavana to fulfill the mitzvah. And that's why. We have to daven.
If the Kohen is giving somebody a bracha after any time, isn't that Bal Tosef?
Not one more time.
If a Kohen gives a bracha to someone all day, is that Bal Tosef?
No, because he's obligated to give it. The Bal Tosef would mean that he's adding a fourth bracha. Saying it again and again and again, that's